Chapter 9. The Parents. When Miss Honey emerged from the headmistress's study, most of the children were outside on the playground. Her first move was to go around to various teachers who'd taught the senior classes and borrow from them a number of textbooks on algebra, geometry, French, English literature, and then she sought out Matilda and called her into the classroom. "There's no point," she said, "in you sitting in the classroom doing nothing while I am teaching the rest of the class the 2 times tables and how to spell cat and rat and mouse. So during each lesson I shall give you one of these textbooks to study. At the end of the lesson you could come up to me with your questions if you have any, and I shall try to help you. How does that sound?" "Thank you, Miss Honey," Matilda said. "That sounds fine." Moved into a higher form, but for the moment the headmistress wishes you to stay here where you are. "Very well, Miss Honey," said. "Thank you so much for getting me those books." What a nice child she is, Miss Honey thought. I don't care what her father said about her. She seems very quiet and gentle to me, and not a bit stuck up in spite of her brilliance. In fact, she hardly seems to be aware of it at all. So when the class reassembled, Matilda went to her desk and began to study a textbook on geometry, which Miss Honey had given her. The teacher kept a half eye on her all the time, and noticed the child very soon became deeply absorbed in the book. She never glanced up once during the entire lesson. Miss Honey, meanwhile, was making another decision. She was deciding that she would go and have a secret talk with Matilda's mother and father as soon as possible. She simply refused to let this matter rest where it was. The whole thing was ridiculous. She couldn't believe that the parents were totally unaware of their daughter's remarkable talents. After all, Mr. Wormwood was a successful motor car dealer, so she presumed that he was fairly intelligent himself. In any event, parents never underestimated the abilities of their own children. Quite reverse. Sometimes it was well-nigh possible for a teacher to convince their proud father and mother that their beloved offspring was a complete nitwit. Miss Honey felt confident that she would have no difficulty in convincing Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood that Matilda was something very special indeed. The trouble was going to be to stop them from getting over-enthusiastic. And now Miss Honey's hopes began to expand even further. She started wondering whether permission might be sought from the parents to give her a private tuition to Matilda. The prospect of coaching a child as bright as this appealed to her enormously as a teacher. And suddenly she decided she would go and call Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood that very evening. She would go fairly late, between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock, when Matilda was sure to be in bed. And that is precisely what she did. Having got the address from the school records, Miss Honey set out for a walk from her own home to the Wormwoods' house shortly after 9. She found the house in a pleasant street where each of the smallish buildings were separated from its neighbors by a bit of the garden. It was a modern brick house that could not have been cheap, but the name on the house said Cozy Nook. The Nosy Cook might have been a better, Miss Honey thought. She was given to playing with words that way. She walked up the path and rang the bell, and while she stood there waiting, she could hear the television blaring inside. The door was opened by a small, ratty-looking man with a thin, ratty mustache who was wearing a sport coat and had on an orange and red stripes. "Yes," he said, peering out at Miss Honey. "If you're selling us a raffle ticket, I don't want it." "I'm not," Miss Honey said, "and please forgive me for butting in on you like this. I am Matilda's teacher in school, and it is very important that I have word with you and your wife." "Got into trouble already, has she?" Mr. Wormwood said, blocking the doorway. "Well, it's your responsibility from now on. You'll have to deal with her." "She is not in trouble at all," Miss Honey said. "I have come with good news about her." "Quite startling news, Mr. Wormwood. Do you think I might come in for a minute to talk to you about Matilda?" "We're right in the middle of watching one of our favorite programs," Mr. Wormwood said. "This is most inconvenient. Why don't you come back some other time?" Miss Honey began to lose patience. "Mr. Wormwood," she says, "if you think some rotten TV program is more important than your daughter's future, then you ought to be not a parent. Why don't you switch the darn thing off and listen to me?" That shook Mr. Wormwood. He was not used to being spoken this way. He peered carefully at the slim, frail woman who stood there so resolutely out on the porch. "Okay, very well then," he snapped. "Come on in. Let's get it over with." Miss Honey swept in briskly. "Mrs. Wormwood isn't going to thank you for this," the man said as he led her into the sitting room, where a large platinum blonde woman was standing there gazing rapturously at the TV screen. "Who is the woman said, not looking round. "She says she has to talk to us about Matilda." He crossed to the TV set and turned down the sound, but left the picture on the screen. "Don't do that, Harry," Miss Wormwood cried. "Willard is just about to propose to Angelica." "You can still watch it while we're talking," Mr. Wormwood said. "This is Matilda's teacher. She says she's got some sort of news to give us." "My name is Jennifer Honey," Miss Honey said. "How do you do, Mrs. Wormwood?" Mrs. Wormwood glared at her and said, "That's the trouble, then." Nobody invited Miss Honey to sit down, so she chose a chair and sat down anyway. "This," she said, "was your daughter's first day at school." "We know that," Miss Wormwood said in a ratty about missing the program. "Is that all you come to tell us?" Miss Honey stared into the other woman's gray eyes, and she allowed the silence to hang in the air until Mr. Wormwood became uncomfortable. "Do you wish to explain why I came?" she said. "Get on with it, then," Mrs. Wormwood said. "I'm sure you know," Miss Honey said, "that children in the bottom class of school are not expected to be able to read, spell, or juggle with numbers when they first arrive. 5-year-olds cannot do that, but Matilda can do it. She can do it all. And if I'm to believe her—" "I wouldn't," Mrs. Wormwood said. She was still ratty at the loosing sound on the TV. "Was she lying, then," Miss Honey said, "when she told me that nobody taught her to multiply or to read? Did either of you teach her?" "Teach her what?" Mr. Wormwood said. "To read books," Miss Honey said. "Perhaps you did. Perhaps she was lying. Perhaps you have shelves full of books all over the house, and I wouldn't know. Perhaps you are both great readers." "Of course we read," Mr. Wormwood said. "Don't be so daft." "I read the auto car and motor cover from cover each week." "This child has already read an astonishing number of books," Miss Honey said. "I was simply trying to find out if she came from a family that loves good literature." "We don't hold with book reading," Miss Wormwood said. "Can you make a living from sitting on your fanny and reading storybooks?" "We don't keep them in the house." "I see," Miss Honey said. "Well, I came to tell you that Matilda has a brilliant mind, but I expect you know that already." "Of course I knew she could read," the mother said. "She spends her life up in her room buried in some silly books." "But that doesn't intrigue you," Miss Honey said. "That little 5-year-old child is reading long adult novels by Dickens and Hemingway. Doesn't it make you jump up and down with excitement?" "Not particularly," the mother said. "I am not in favor of blue-stocking girls, and a girl should think about making herself look attractive so she can get a good husband on her." "Looks are more important than books, Miss Hunky." "The name is Honey," Miss Honey said. "Now look at me," Mrs. Wormwood said, "then look at you. You chose books, I chose looks. Miss Honey looked at the plain, plump person with a smug set of pudding face who was sitting across the room. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said, you chose books and I chose look," Mrs. Wormwood said. "And who's finished up the better off?" "Me, of course. I'm sitting pretty in a nice house with a successful businessman, and you're left teaching lots of nasty little children the ABCs. "Quite right, Sugar Plum," Mr. Wormwood said, casting a look of simpering sloppiness at his wife. "It would have been able to make a cat sick." Miss Honey decided that if she was going to get anywhere with these people, she must not lose her temper. "I have told you not all of it yet," she said. "Matilda, so far as I can gather, is an early stage kind of a mathematical genius. She can multiply complicated figures in her head like lightning." "What's the point of that when you could buy a calculator?" Mr. Wormwood said. "A girl doesn't get a man by being brainy," Miss Wormwood said. "Look at the film star, for instance," she added, pointing at the silent TV screen, where a blossomy female was being embraced by a craggy actor in moonlight. "You don't think she got him like that by multiplying figures at him, do you?" "Not likely. And now she's going to marry her. You see, if he doesn't, she's going to live in a mansion with a butler and lots of maids." Miss Honey could hardly believe what she was hearing. She heard parents like this existed all over the place, and their children turned out to be delinquents and dropouts, but it was still a shock to meet a pair of them in the flesh. "Matilda's trouble," she said, trying once again, "is the fact that she is so far ahead of everyone else around her that it might be worth thinking about having some sort of extra private tuition. I seriously believe that she could be brought up into university standards in 2 or 3 years with proper coaching." "University!" Mr. Wormwood shouted, bouncing in his chair. "Who wants to go to university, for heaven's sakes? All they learn there is bad habits." "That's not true," Miss Honey said. "If you had a heart attack this minute and you had to call a doctor, that doctor would be from a university, and he would have graduated. If you got sued for selling some rotten second-hand car, you'd have gotten a lawyer, and he'd have been a university graduate too." "Do not despise clever people, Mr. Wormwood, but I can see we're not going to agree like this. I'm sorry I burst in on you like this." Miss Honey rose from her chair and walked out of the room. Mr. Wormwood followed her to the front door and said, "Good of you to come, Miss Hawkins, or Miss Harris, is it?" "It's neither," Miss Honey said, "but I'll let it go," and she went away.